Hello, and welcome to the Mindmeld Live with Shell Protocol. I'm Cairo. Today we have our founder Kenny and bumblefudge, who has had quite a journey through the world of Web3 and has a lot of very fascinating things to say about the state of the sector. So I guarantee this is going to be a lively and informative conversation. We're very glad to have him here with us.
Thanks.
Kenny, do you want to do a quick intro and then we'll have our guest intro himself?
Yes, sir. Well,
Great.
Bumble Fudge, welcome to the Mindmeld Live podcast. Um, for people in the audience that are maybe not familiar with Bumble Fudge, he has a background in KYC, working for Center, which was a subsidiary of a company you may have heard of called Circle, and another company called Coinbase. And through that experience, uh, doing deep work in identity and KYC stuff. He has a very unique and interesting perspective on regulation in crypto, both past, present, and future. And we try to have a wide variety of audiences on this podcast, both from builders, from developers, from people in finance, from people uh, more on like the computer science side, and it's great to have someone who's been on the identity and regulation side to join us. And I guess Bumblefudge, maybe we could start off by you can walk us through your crypto journey. Like, how did you go from being a non Web3 acolyte to sort of joining the Web3 cult, if you will? And I describe it as a cult with love.
It is. It is. I mean, I always say in college I really enjoyed a class I took on Chinese history, and one of the weird sort of theses that the professor had on Chinese history was that it was just a series of cults all the way down. Almost every dynasty was toppled by a religious dissident movement. So it's like easier to get converts to a religion than it is to get people to imagine a life after capitalism, or a life after the Chinese Empire. So religions kept building a bunch of momentum, and then like the last minute be like, oh, by the way, we have to like kill the king and change the government, and that's how it worked every time a dynasty went down. Anyways, my my trajectory is pretty nonlinear, as is my storytelling skills, and I worked in software for a long time doing front end stuff like web one, and then a little bit of web two, and then I switched careers, fucked off for 15 years, came back, had a friend who was a Bitcoiner and investing in shitcoins in during the what were they called? Uh, master node, mastercoin craze. These weird sort of like early staking
The colored
experiments.
coins.
What's that?
Colored coins, right?
This was a million years ago. Yeah, this was more than 5 years ago. And then I was advising him and just setting up nodes and doing like a very primitive early kind of infrastructure, just setting up Docker containers and sort of doing what research I could on the projects to see which ones were worth having enough of to stake. So then after that little episode, I moved into the identity space, and that's where I've done most of my work until Center. It was Center needed someone who knew the identity space to work on this KYC product, thinking about sort of like unconventional architectures and wallet-based um, strong authentication, basically, was the goal. And I would say that for people curious about that project, it was all open source. The prototype's on GitHub. It's called verite.id, verite.id, and I'm proud of that work. It incorporated some earlier open source stuff that was done 3 jobs ago at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and it's kind of like what Block is doing right now. They're still very much thinking about wallet-based strong authentication for the TBD project and the TBDEX project. So they want to have a decentralized exchange that does its KYC in a similar way. Um, and a lot of the companies I worked with at Center are still chugging along, like Nota Bene, Violet, Nuggets. There's a lot of interesting companies doing cool compliance stuff along similar lines. It just didn't become the consortium we were trying to make it. So yeah, I do think. Oh, sorry, journey. And so in terms of my journey, I've worked for, I don't know, different identity and Web3 companies and sort of everywhere in between. I think the uniting thread through all of my gigs has been that I always try to think a little outside the company form. I don't think it's, I think we have this extremely strong bias towards a mode of organization and governance, which is really foregrounds the for-profit company as the only possible mode of organizing society and capitalism. I'm not a huge fan of companies. I tend to work at companies like two at a time. I tend to have like always be moonlighting, always be gig working, always be in a DAO, always be doing open source work that spans five companies, all contributing half of FTE each. Um, so yeah, that's sort of where I'm at. I currently am working on a couple different projects, um, sponsored by Wallet Connect, doing chain agnostic standards alliance stuff.
Oh, we love
Um,
Wallet Connect. We had them on a
yeah,
couple months ago, and they were great.
yeah, Vanessa, old friend. So yeah, and so yeah, that's the context in which your listeners are probably most likely to see me. If they go to Istanbul, we've got a day-long chain agnostic event, and I'll be bouncing around, um, going to going to events that whole week. I also work with Protocol Labs at the moment on some big things, IPFS, public goods, infrastructure kind of stuff. Increasingly, Web3 uses low-level IPFS stuff under the hood. Like a lot of people don't realize about when ETH went to ETH2, the whole complicated two-chain complicated solution uses a lot of libp2p for the networking layer. So that kind of stuff I work on. I'm really curious about data availability and how that's going to go over time. But yeah, again, that's just the through line is weird governance and open source. That's what I care about. Companies are dumb. We don't need them. We don't need them where we're going.
Uh, well, exciting. I feel like there's a million threads we could jump into just from this. We
Yeah,
certainly
don't
have
don't
like
tell
fertile
don't tell
ground.
our investors that.
I
I
want
mean, some
to
of my best friends are companies. I'm sure you guys are great.
I want to mention
Well
for
put.
our listeners, if you are here live, um, sorry, there's Amazon happening. Speaking of companies, uh, if you're listening live, jump into the Mindmeld chat channel on our Discord. Ask your questions, give us your comments, and I will be reading along, and I can read those out to our fellow host and guest as they come up. So don't be shy. Raise your questions. Flame us. Keep us entertained. And with that, Kenny, how do you think we should branch?
Well, yeah, I feel like KYC is a super big and important part um, in pretty much every financial industry except perhaps currently like DeFi and Web3.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe a good place to start is instead of trying to understand the future of Web3 regulation, maybe just to understand like what why do firm what is KYC?
Yeah.
Why do traditional financial and centralized exchanges have to do it?
Hmm.
And and then I guess like kind of why like what is trying to be accomplished with KYC like from like a regulatory standpoint? And B, like what is this? How does this affect the operations of the firm? So that was let me unpack that. Let me
Yep.
unpack that. So first is what is KYC? Second is like from a regulatory standpoint, like why do we do it? And also what's its effect on the user experience and on like the company's organization and general tactics and strategies. So how does it affect
Yep.
companies, users, etc.?
Well, that's actually that's funny because you answered them as three different questions. I'm going to answer the first one with the third because the we have this common sensical idea of KYC, which is that your counterparty needs to know who you are, or that companies need the passport of everyone who they have on their books. But that's actually not what KYC is, and the definition, like KYC, isn't actually defined very concretely in law. In law, it says you have to be making a reasonable effort to know who all your customers are, just in general and in aggregate, not even individually, right? So, like for a long time, KYC, like there was this early stage in Web3 KYC where people were like, well, if it's not really written down, then how can you hold me to it, man? That's like your opinion, man. And they lost a bunch of lawsuits, and they're like, okay, wait, so okay, let's back up. Let's try a little more good faith here. Um, the way KYC really should be thought of is almost like holistic or systemic. So it isn't so much that there's any concrete minimum information you have to have on each customer. You just have to have what all your competitors have, and you have to be able to like de-anonymize people when you need to, right? So one premise, like the revocable pseudonymity thesis, is that if everyone's KYC were in a break in case of emergency behind a glass door, so that all of your counterparties didn't have your passport number, but they had some sort of private key that they could get it if they needed it, or if they had, they could call a 1-800 number and get the FBI to provide the second key or something. So, like, revocable pseudonymity is actually an entirely valid scheme if you get enough people to actually do it. And that sort of speaks to the scale issue here. So, like, the point of KYC isn't that individuals have to be known in any specific way. It's more like individuals in aggregate have to be known in a reasonable due diligence, enough, I'll know enough when I see it kind of way. Like there's this sort of murkiness to KYC that really has to do with a kind of like a self-regulatory model of traditional finance. Like in traditional finance, there aren't concrete technical standards for KYC at all, not at the state level, not at the national level. There are these sorts of norms, and companies are just sort of expected to audit themselves and snitch on each other when they have reason to suspect one of them isn't doing the KYC they say they are. And another funny thing about KYC is that it's subject to IP. So the definition is you have to do enough, whatever that is. It has to be a reasonable amount of due diligence. And what due diligence you do is a company secret. Like the banks can't tell you what other banks do. In fact, they won't tell you what they themselves do. They have this weird sort of black box approach to like their KYC, and no one wants to sell their KYC. No one wants to make their KYC exportable. Or I shouldn't say no one. It is historic. It was historically, and in my personal experience, very hard to get people to imagine a circumstance in which their customers could uh, take attestations of their degree of KYC to third parties and say, "Hey, that bank vouches for me." Like, no one wants to vouch for each other's KYC because this is like a weird IP arms race. It's like a closed source arms race to know what is reasonable at scale. So, anyways, that's all like a somewhat esoteric way of describing the problem space. Um, I think the real problem for me is that if a public blockchain is pseudonymous by default and you bolt on KYC, there's sort of an unprovable SLA. Like you can say because I've bolted on these checks or these processes and because I check for the soulbound token that can only be put there by someone doing proper KYC by a trusted third party, um, you're sort of saying I'm 99.99999% of these customers were actually KYC'd, but you can't really prove that last one. You can't prove the how many nines are in your SLA, and that is a problem that speaks to the sort of um, moving target of KYC. Like you're never done with KYC because the regulations are sort of vague, and it's almost like you have done enough KYC when a consortium of fellow banks and money transmitters and sort of regulated entities and broker dealers will say, okay, the amount of KYC they've done is equivalent to what we do in TradFi. But like that's the ultimate moving target. We'll never get them to to say we've done that because we just like they never will, even if we do.
Sounds like KYC in Web3 is a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, where if all the Web3 DeFi protocols, if we all agree not
Yeah,
to like to do like only this much, then we're okay. But a second some some jerk just like, oh, like
yeah,
I'm gonna do this much KYC, and that kind of like
makes us
it
look
kind of
bad.
spoil the party for the rest of us.
It also it seems to me that it's sort of like, at least with TradFi, it's like instead of a process-based enforcement, it's like a results-based enforcement. Like if you
Yeah,
are a bank and you are wiring a shit ton of money to like Iran, the government is going to come in and be like, obviously your KYC is insufficient because look at where your
yeah,
money is. But it's sort of like, as long as you're not like the go-to bank for crime, like how you achieve that is like they're not,
HSBC.
you know.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
HSBC. I mean, there was that
you're
time when there was a go-to bank for the Sinaloa cartel.
um like, and it seems
I've
like the
heard
same
these
thing for
rumors
me.
myself.
It's like I don't imagine that the federal government would come really hard at a crypto protocol over KYC process. It seems like what they would do is they would wait for some clear case of money laundering, of
Yeah,
tornadoing, of North Korean meth trafficking, and then they would use that and they'd kind of build an argument backwards from there and say, well, this happened because your KYC was insufficient. Is that correct?
exactly. That is exactly how it is actually playing out right now in real time. Like this week, the Wall Street Journal said last year over a billion um, crypto was stolen and then sold for USD in North Korea to the tune of over a billion. So unless you can promise me that won't happen again in 2023, you're all dead. That's kind of the White House line at the moment. And that isn't really about KYC. And if we had done everything right with KYC 5 years ago, and there had were still a billion ending up in North Korea, we'd be in the same hot water. Because
Yeah.
in a way, like it's sort of a ironically it's kind of a collective punishment thing, but but it's a I mean the difference between collective punishment and collective self-regulation the way finance works is largely by self-regulation, and they let these huge pipelines of money go bouncing around the planet as long as there's enough of a sort of deadlocked oligopoly where people can snitch on each other if someone goes HSBC and starts laundering for Sinaloa.
Yeah.
So like that,
It's also like, the US is increasingly trying to maintain its geopolitical order. So of course, like where money can and can't go is going to be this massive, massive political issue. And if you have something, it's almost like you get a pressure differential in
yeah,
the economy of a single country. And then, something that flows more freely, like tokens, of course it's going to function to some degree as a release valve for that economic imbalance that's sanction imposed.
The sanctions thing and the hacks are two different issues, right? Like in the sense
Yeah,
that Lazarus getting over 1 billion in 1 year is one black eye, and the amount of tether that gets off ramped to Russia and Cyprus via sketchy money transmitters that shouldn't have licenses in the first place, that's a separate black eye.
I
And we sort of,
kind of they're sort of causally the same though, because like if North Korea is allowed to like interact with the world economy, there are
right.
probably
Oh,
like
yeah,
exports that it could achieve that would be more profitable than crypto hacks. But it's like, if you have a
I
bunch
see
of
what you
smart
mean.
guys with
Yeah.
computers and they're not allowed to do legal trade, this
Yeah.
becomes like the highest yield act that they can do, you know?
Yeah, in that sense, totally.
Yeah.
What I meant was that there's sort of two different systemic problems. One
Mm.
is that we keep putting real money into janky ass bridges, and that's like more of a technical problem. I think I like to think of it as like in TradFi there are elaborate underwriting and insurance schemes. So you're not allowed to put too much money into something risky unless there's someone underwriting it and like
Yeah.
literally making people whole if like $1 billion disappears somewhere. So when bridges get hacked and like bye bye $1 billion worth of ETH or whatever, there's no one underwriting that. Those $1 billion are just gone. Or when these like super hypothecated Bitcoin schemes, like after SBF, when Gemini's money got frozen by I think it was Genesis. Don't quote me on that. If I apologies, don't sue me if I got the names wrong. That kind of stuff when money just disappears because it's over hypothecated or because bridges are the worst of multiple security models. The those sort of like holes in the ledger that are just like unhealable are, to me, that's where the North Korea problem comes from. The North Korea problem comes from there aren't enough regulated players in the game for the game to be insurable. If anyone were insuring all of this, then there would be sort of more of a collective incentive not to let North Korea get 1 billion a year. that
Do
that
you
would be a
think,
billion that comes out of all of our pockets.
do you
I
think
mean,
there is any
I personally feel
argument
quite
to be
motivated to
made?
not have Lazarus like steal money from like the shell protocol. I don't think it's a lack of motivation. I think it's just new technology getting exploited. Like I think we this is probably one of the few things that like, you know, crypto builders and the US government agree on, which is like we don't want North Koreans hacking us and taking our money. Um, like that doesn't I think that's one of the few things that's like uncontroversial unless you're in North Korea.
Yeah.
except, except insofar as
Nothing
like
about
whose
North Koreans. There's a lot of
responsibility?
very talented hackers all over the world. You know, props, kudos to all of you. I'm not trying to make you sound like you're less than the North Koreans. I want to be inclusive here, but the North Koreans, I think they have a reputation for a reason, which is they seem to be damn effective.
They're good. They're good. Um, well, so maybe another way of putting it is the collective responsibility is what needs to be achieved, and KYC is just like the individual grains of sand thing, but we need like dams and levees, right? And like half of Web3 being reasonably well KYC'd adds up to one form of dam. Like that's one axis where we need to go from where we're at to way better pretty quick if we want to have an answer to why does $1 billion keep going to North Korea every year. Another question, I mean, you could flip it on its head and say like, well, technology is new, so like, you know, mistakes will be made, but when you put real money through brand new version 0.9 pipes, like that's a risk management issue. So like if there's billions of dollars flowing through these pipes of like janky beta software, that's something a bank wouldn't do because their insurance wouldn't let them, and we do it because we insurance doesn't exist here. So it's sort of like this bleeding edge argument almost misunderstands the question, because like if it's bleeding edge, then don't put real money through it would be the regulators and
Yeah,
perspective
don't
on
you think
this.
in an environment of rational actors, not having insurance would make you take fewer bridge risks? It almost sounds like you're describing players who can't assess the risk of their money being hacked.
I don't want to go victim blaming here, but I do think that the incentives are wrong if there are Peter Pan's uh, piping retail off that cliff, though. Like there's something a little wrong with there being billions in the bridges to hack in the first place. I
Yeah.
was never a huge fan of bridges. They always struck me as like the worst of all worlds, or like a corner not worth cutting. But I'm a pretty risk averse guy, and I do think that the attitude towards risk is kind of what's missing. I think that a lot of we're to some degree. I'm not. I don't think it's entirely off base to say that we're like speed running the 19th century history of banking, and we haven't really left the wildcat period before the formation of the Fed. I don't think that like DAI is cool and all, but I don't think DAI is yet a force of stability creation like the Fed was invented to be after the Civil War. I do think we're sort of still on our way to discovering like underwriting and on our way to discovering a Fed. But these
So
things,
hold on.
yeah.
What was the Wildcat era of banking? Um,
I mean, it
and
it was the shitcoin era. It was the OG shitcoin era of the U.S. economy. It was like the during the Civil War there was kind of like no hard money. There was like no good money. So states were just like printing debt, and everything was debt financed, and things got extremely speculative. People were like, "I'll give you 10 Carolina dollars for 4 Mississippi dollars," and then there were decentralized exchanges and no insurance and no backstops, and just it was like the YOLO era of money. It was the weirdest. Uh, it was like a hothouse for economic experimentation. There's a couple good books on it. One of them is called The Money Men, not to be confused with the other two books with the exact same title. There's one called The Money Men, but the subtitle is something about wildcats or the making of the Fed or something like that. That's a really good one. Um, but yeah, I mean, I do think that like in a way, the KYC problem has to do with what scale you're looking at. Like KYC is not a problem that can be solved by individual protocols or individual wallets or even individual L1s. Although one of the most convincing arguments is like you should just have an L1 that you can't create a wallet without KYCing somewhere. And everyone hates that idea. I mean, Everscale doesn't hate that idea. They ran with it and I maybe even patented it. But the idea that like everyone is by default anon and can have an unlimited number of wallets, and you can sort of make like a KYC perimeter and then like have your protocol within it, to me is just unrealistic. Like that isn't how the technology works. I feel like that's building KYC in too high up in the stack for it to be realistic just from a software point of view. um,
Well,
so
it,
other than
it
keeping
seems
like
like, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like there are a lot of players in Web3 for whom the core of the ideology and the vision does revolve around this sort of anonymity. And if there is an effort to KYC, it is sort of in the spirit of like placating enforcement. rather than truly like achieving the positive effects of like structurally core KYC. Like, do you think there's anyone who's almost like not trying very hard with their KYC because it's more about appeasing the law than actually building a de-anonymized system?
Do I think anyone is playing lip service or following the letter and not the spirit of the law? Yes. I think most actors are doing KYC theater. Like I do think that the point, I mean, it depends what you mean by enforcement, because enforcement is statal, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
um money, well, the funny thing about money is that money isn't supposed to be global. It was never supposed to be global. I mean, the
Yeah.
USD became global when America conquered the world. And within the Pax Americana, the dollar is near global and is allowed to flow in huge quantities outside of US borders with non US entities doing the pipelining. But with the exception of USD, currencies weren't invented to take place outside of the control of the state. So, like, money is a state technology. So, the
Mm-hmm.
idea that trans state money, A, could be allowed to exist, B, could be allowed to have like stable exchange rates with state money, and somehow crimes would be enforceable if all parties involved were citizens of one state, and that state would enforce it, but like relative to this money that I don't know. I think
Yeah.
the concept of enforcement and crime and criminal law is, or even tort, is sort of weirdly like square peg in a round hole. But
Yeah.
I take your point that accountability in the most criminal sense, like the basic legal attribution of identity to actors, is necessary but insufficient to compliance. Like if you
I
don't
guess
even have that, then you have
I guess
not
what I meant by
you're not
enforcement
even
is
on the board.
a state trying to punish you or stop you from existing, right? That's all I meant. And yeah, I see your point.
Oh,
And I think, uh-huh.
I mean, there's, I don't know. I think people get too caught up on whether or not states recognize cryptocurrencies or allow cryptocurrencies or want to punish you for holding or punish you for
Mhm.
underreporting or underpaying your taxes on. But really, I think like I don't even think very few states are really aggressive about that or have even made up their minds about that. Like they're still trying to get some more basic understanding of like, is this a money transaction in the first place? Like, do financial fraud laws apply? I don't know. I mean, most regulators I talk to are honestly less worried about, like, regulators aren't cops, and one of the most offensive things you can do is call a regulator a cop. Like they're not in the business of going around and checking people's 1040s. And like
That's
if you say that's the
fascinating.
point of the law, they're like, screw you, I'm in a totally different agency. Like I have actual problems to solve, right? Like so they're worried about the stability of the dollar. Like the SEC doesn't give a fuck how many of us are like shooting ourselves in the foot or subjecting ourselves to fraud. They're worried about contaminating the capital markets. Like USD, Forex markets are the top geopolitical priority, period. And like whether or not individual people are defrauding each other is sort of a DOJ matter some of the time. But like the SEC, I think the stuff about like protecting investors is kind of a red herring. Like we should really think of Gensler's top priority as protecting the capital markets and the stability of the US dollar. Like, if crypto got big enough to be a threat to USD, it would be equivalent to an international terrorism cult. Like, it would be an existential threat to the empire itself. Like,
Yeah.
empire is like the highest priority in all government, or like in US government, right? Like who's
Yeah.
president right now, or like what the law is, those are all downstream of like Pax Americana. That's always the top priority of any US policy.
You'd hope so.
I don't know. I just
Might
think
be
like
giving them
sometimes
more
we.
credit than I would.
What's that, Kenny?
You might be giving them more credit than I would give them.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I agree that that's like the highest like deeply seated goal of the machine. I think the machine is also stricken with like certain kinds of insanity in that it's made up of individuals who have like conflicting wants. I don't know. But overall,
Like the whole like fact that there's a political faction in the House of Representatives that seems intent on like pretty much holding the whole global financial system hostage to accomplish a couple of, to me, unclear like political goals. It seems like a counter example to that, where like maybe there are factions in the government, sort of like the deep state, as it were, um, they really do feel like sort of like I think of like George Bush Senior as kind of like the paragon of that movement, where he was there as it was being built, and he helped sort of like usher it through the end of the Cold War and into kind of like the 90s. And but I don't know, there's a lot of people with a lot of different ideas running around in Washington D.C., and I don't know what all of them are thinking. Some of them I think think exactly the way you described it, and I think many of them maybe have their own agenda,
Well, I
or
think
have an agenda that doesn't necessarily align with that 100% of the time.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of we can jokingly call it the deep state, or we can sort of like take the Steve Bannon interpretation of history and see it as a bad thing that not all of the U.S. government is susceptible to direct democratic influence. But I actually think it's a good thing that 51% of the senators of the parliamentary branch and like 80% of the executive branch and legislative branch don't actually care who wins. They don't lose their job. There isn't like a spoils system. We don't get a whole new government every time the party changes in the national elections. Most of DC is pretty inert and above the fray of two party bullshit. Like two party bullshit, if anything, too much of government is above the fray because in a multi party system, the swings are further. Two parties sort of ensure that anything they want an excuse not to do, they can blame on the other party, and anything they want to do still happens, no matter who's in power, right? So, like, I do think the SEC, the Fed, uh, pretty much the entire apparatus of financial regulation is like 95% immune to who's winning elections that year. They don't care. Like, they're above Congress. Like the House of Representatives is a sideshow by comparison. No offense. Like I don't think it really like it's all theater, and you can tell it's theater because they keep pulling the plug and shutting down Congress for like months at a time, like every year now, ever since what's his face Newt Gingrich discovered that trick in the 90s. You can just interrupt Congress and kind of nothing happens. Kind of like most of DC still functions, which is sort of proof that most of DC is upstream, not downstream of Congress. I think Congress is maybe the TV news version of the U.S. government. uh, but this is maybe getting a little off topic. You can bring me back if there's
yeah,
a
no, I mean,
time
I
limit or
think that
something.
sort of everything we've jumped into here could be its own episode. I'm
Yes.
curious hearing your clear depth of knowledge and opinion. You've been around the block. Do you do long form writing? Is there a
Mm.
nonfiction Bumblefudge book somewhere in the works there?
Um, it's funny. I've written two books of nonfiction that have nothing to do with any of this. I wrote
What?
a book about torture and crime fiction in 70s Argentina. I wrote a slang dictionary. I've written some stuff. But no, actually, none of these topics. Oh, actually, no, I can give you guys a link to some long
Where
form writing that's pretty fun.
where is this wellspring from which you draw all your
Bullshit?
academic and creative energy? Yeah. It
What?
seems like it just flows endlessly.
I don't know. Some of those pieces are actually written in extremely compressed form into the Ethereum mainnet blockchain.
That's
Uh,
cool.
this is an early experiment in blockchain publishing, like pre Arweave, pre
Mhm.
Filecoin. Popola is a really cool project I worked on a long time ago.
Ken,
So
it's a real talk show when we let people plug their books.
That's
You
true.
know,
Yeah.
that's like a
I mean,
prerequisite for
apparently,
a talk
apparently anyone
show.
can go and read it if they just sync a full node to Ethereum blockchain and they know how to like unpack it to
Yeah, if
the.
you have a node, it's already on your device. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
go.
no light clients. You need a full node. Yeah, so yeah, that's a place where some writing of mine is. I don't know where I tend to just be an obsessive researchy guy. So part of why I have had so many jobs in 10 years is that I get bored working for one company and like pushing on one product for too long. So like unless I get a new set of rabbit holes to chase down every 6 months, I move on to the next thing. That's how I know so much about KYC from only 1 year of working on
Let me ask something that sort of gets back to
it.
what we were talking about before, if that's okay, Kenny. I'm getting excited here. Do you see, let's see, it's hard to sort of characterize like all of Web3 devs into like one sort of ideology or goal, but like to paint in broad strokes, do you see the win conditions for like DeFi builders and the win conditions for the American empire as being like mutually incompatible? Or do you think we can get to a state where both get what they want?
Hmm.
Revolution or I guess win-win cooperation to borrow a phrase from Xi Jinping.
I mean, uh, do I think? I mean, so I implicit in your first in the way you phrased that was the idea
Uh-huh.
that the ideology of the people building it has much bearing. And there, I'm not so sure. I do think that to some degree, the politics of the individuals has little bearing on the politics of the industry. A good example of this is the classic Silicon Valley ideology. Most people skewed pretty left in Silicon Valley in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and yet produced a set of technologies that mostly got sold to the military apparatus and mostly accelerated income concentration in the 1% more than any other technology in the history of mankind. So, like, I don't think that the devs' understanding of the politics of what they're doing has much bearing on the effect their technology has once it goes out into the market and conquers things. Like the
Mm.
afterlife, the political afterlife of our technologies is not up to us at all. Um, but
You you think that the drive to build is so almost blinding that it prevents
hmm,
the devs from really considering the second order effects of what they build?
oh no, well maybe that too, but I don't think any technology is influenced all that. Or the politics. So if you judge a technology by its effects in the world, its
Hmm.
effects in the world are unpredictable. Like by definition, it's not a technology if its political afterlife is predictable. It's
Yeah.
uh, if we could predict it, it wouldn't be technology. And the effects our technologies will have. I mean, I that's almost like I don't say this to absolve us of an ethical obligation. We might all still be Oppenheimers building a bomb that
Uh-huh.
ends government and ruins the state for future generations. But I do think that the question was whether the state's priorities could be met, or whether there could be an incentive alignment between Web3 and the state. And I do think there are many possible futures in which it is very convenient for the American empire or some other configuration of power in the world
Yeah.
um, to benefit from having non-stable money. My contrarian take is that it isn't non-stable money yet. It's all just a proxy for the dollar right now. Like right now, crypto is a Amazon gift card system where people can turn USD into something else temporarily, but they all turn it back into dollars on the other end when they need money to pay their bills or their landlord or their human smuggler or whatever
Yeah.
whatever they're
True.
doing.
No one prices Bitcoin in terms of Bitcoin anymore. Wherever they price Bitcoin in terms of dollars.
You could almost say it was unrealistic to have ever done it any other way. It was always just USD. So in that sense, I think I don't know that the goal is even to build non-state money. I think we're building a non-state USD. uh,
Yeah.
and I,
And that makes sense if you look at the way that people use it in countries that have weak and irresponsible monetary policy, which is that they basically just sock their income in ETH and essentially derive the benefit from ETH that they would from going and buying black market dollars. You
if
know,
they
it's
were
just on
allowed
cheap.
to. Yeah, black market is the
Yeah.
operative term there. Most of the world has
Uh-huh.
currency controls. Most people aren't
Yeah.
allowed to have as much access to USD as they want. So that's why
Yeah.
crypto is super popular places people want dollars and can't get them because they're just dollars. And I do think that when you talk about the like impotence mismatch between the North Korean economy and other labor markets or something,
Mhm.
we it's the exact same thing with money. If you make anything automatically 24/7 tradable with dollars, you've made it a proxy for dollars. So it can go places dollars can't, but it's acting as dollars because everyone knows they can always trade any crypto coin for any other crypto coin for dollars. And
Yeah.
dollars are what most of the world wants. So why would it be anything other than a proxy for dollars? Like it needs to be not tradable for dollars before it is in any way independent from dollars. That's my theory. So I think that it is actually already greatly useful to the US to have a sort of shadow dollar running around doing dollar things, making the dollar more valuable all around the world
Yeah.
where they're not allowed to send dollars. So in some sense, it's already entirely aligned with
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the
That
deep
makes a lot of
state.
sense. Hmm.
The,
Fascinating.
I mean, KYC in that sense, particularly in the third world, or I should say in the uh, dollar-starved world, would be a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
KYC means a lot. Like when I spoke to banks in from around the world um, about various semi-compliant or marginally compliant or compliant enough use cases, they were always like, well, we can't let citizens of our country hold anything that the government will call a proxy for the dollar. Um, and that includes, as you would imagine, dollar denominated deposit coins or
Yeah.
Amazon gift cards. It's the same laws apply as if you were giving people in Nigeria Amazon gift cards, which people do all the time, by the way. It's a whole enforcement problem for the Nigerian government, how much of the
Yeah.
Nigerian economy is done in Amazon credit, right? Um, so in that sense, we're sort of a better analogy would be Amazon. Like Ethereum is like Amazon in the sense that it is a dollar proxy that travels further than the dollar does. And like it is already very useful to America to have the people that want dollars having something similar to dollars. The only problem is that no one wants dollars more than people trying to move their money out of Russia that they've stolen from this chaos of 1989. You know, like the problem isn't Nigeria, it's Cyprus.
Yeah. Yeah.
if it were
So
just Nigeria, the U.S. government would be very happy. It's actually very beneficial to U.S. foreign policy the way crypto works in most of the non-sanctioned world.
mhm.
But I mean, I don't know. Sort of to wrap up a little because we're over time. The
Oh, no worries.
the the big picture, like you have to think in terms of externalities and systemic costs, right? And like the if you see crypto as a whole, it has these systemic problems like hackers making off with billions a year and using it to buy nuclear weapons, people moving money
I hope not.
in and out of Russia. Those are sort of problems that like a collective solution needs to be found for, or we'll all be collectively punished. Like they will clip our wigs and they will make it hard to get real money into the system, and this is crypto will be starved of real money. On ramps will become very complicated, uh, much more expensive, and much more fraught if we don't find collective solutions, insurance policies, auditing systems that actually have consequences, just accountability in general. Like we sort of need cross currency accountability because all of our use cases are really cross currency. And I'm including USD in that metaphor. I don't just mean
Um,
like cross chain.
so can I throw a thought experiment at you
Sure.
here, possibly? And if you have to run at one or in
Mm,
3 minutes?
I can go over a bit. Is it gonna be a
Okay.
long thought experiment? Go for it. Go for it. I'm
That's
just
sort of in
teasing.
your hands. Let's say no. The thought experiment is if you were um, in charge of handling Web3, if you were the U.S.
Ping
government,
for a day.
yeah, and you wanted to keep the benefits of this shadow dollar
Mm.
while stopping all the things you just mentioned, what would you do practically to try and bring about the regime that you want?
Uh, if I were Gensler or Biden or
Yeah, if you were Gensler
if I were Gensler,
Or Joe Biden, so that way you can
or
invoke
Joe
other
Biden,
branches of the executive, other departments of
or
the executive
you know
branch.
the Lovecraftian entity running the entire deep state, some sort of
Yeah, if you're the
Cthulhu himself.
non-human state,
being.
yeah.
So I think that what Gensler wants more than anything is like some sort of scalable accountability, and he's going after centralized exchanges because centralized exchanges are making money on all sides and they're holding tons of risk and they have no incentive to do anything right. Like centralized exchanges are the weakest link in the whole system, and I'm sympathetic. Like I personally agree with the hostility towards centralized exchanges. I think that what the touch points between the fiat banking system and the crypto banking system have to be closely watched and regulated, and they have to be fiduciaries, right? So, uh, applying the traditional securities model to sort of shadow dollars that people buy and sell, thinking of them as investments. Like the JP Cooning posted this poll that some anonymous poll. People didn't know they were being interviewed by the federal government, but this federal government paid for this like basically a Gallup poll. They just called up a bunch of people who hold crypto and said, "Why do you hold crypto?" 80% of them were like, "It's an investment for me." So like if they think it's an investment, it is an investment according to securities law. So like Gensler is going after centralized exchanges and saying, if these people think they're buying from you a speculative asset, you are a broker dealer. Act like a broker dealer. Take the ethical responsibilities that a broker dealer does. Treat their money as money you're responsible for. Be a goddamn fiduciary, right? Like I do think that
Yeah,
we need this fiduciary thing to be ironclad. Whether or not DeFi, like whether or not you can directly take cash out of your account and go gambling cash directly to the market is sort of another question I don't have an easy answer for. I have no idea what that regulatory model should be. But I do think that like the concept of the fiduciary is urgent and 10 years overdue, and we can't have digital identity at all without fiduciaries. Like I'm actually like I got into this because crypto seemed to have more legs than the other identity work I was doing. But really, any identity, any sort of online life, anything important you try to do online, you need fiduciaries. Like someone needs to be responsible to protect your data at scale. And the fact that big
What's a
companies,
fiduciary?
what's that?
Sorry to interrupt, but what's a fiduciary?
Oh, it's just it's sort of it's a fancy word for like an honor bound representative. Like when you go take your fiat money to the bank and you tell your bank guy, hey, I'd like to make 5%, there's amounts of risk they're not allowed to take because they owe you. And if you get wrecked, they have to make you whole because they're a fiduciary. They're sort of like extra high level of obligation to you because you've entrusted your children's college fund to them, right? Um, and I think the concept of the fiduciary is, like we have fiduciaries, but they're kind of inherited from the 19th century, and America's been sort of chipping away at the level of tort, at the level of liability most fiduciaries hold. I think we should be going in the other direction. I think we need new digital forms of fiduciary. We need someone who holds your KYC information should be obligated not to sell that. Like the GDPR is one example of a fiduciary duty. Once someone knows who you really are, they're bound by certain sort of like strict licensing requirements. They lose their right to be a company in Europe if they sell your data willy nilly because like they owe you that amount of privacy, right? Um, so like I think that's a good example of the kind of thing we need. We need a centralized exchange to have certain obligations towards each of their customers that they lose their license to operate if they skimp on. And like that sort of goes way beyond KYC. That's more like what is a corporation's obligation to its customer.
Yeah.
And I really think that's what we need. And I think that goes totally beyond crypto. Like that isn't specific to funny money or real money or anything. That's sort of a table stakes for like our life online. Like now that we're ones and zeros, we need like new kinds of tort. We need new kinds of liability and accountability for us to be able to live online without being constantly uh like thrown to the wolves. Like I think we're sort of in this Lord of the Flies phase of life online where we're sort of getting the worst of all worlds. We're getting the worst of the old paradigm, and like no new paradigm has come in yet to protect us from capital, which just rips us to pieces. Like it's sort of like Law of the Jungle online. Like whoever has enough money can do whatever they want to everyone else's data and privacy and money and whatever. So I think like the broader question is what protects individuals online in general, and that gets into
Have
like
you ever read the book Accelerando?
what?
Have you ever read the book called Accelerando?
I haven't even heard of it, embarrassingly.
Oh, this book I feel like would be right up your alley. Well, it
Charles
starts out
Stross?
kind of yes.
Huh.
It starts out kind of like really out there like cyberpunk, and then it just gets crazier and crazier. Um, and it's sort of it's about a lot of things. It's hard to really summarize the book, but one of the recurring threads throughout the book is kind of about the intersection of capitalism and artificial intelligence and the internet and just computers and software in general. And it starts out very like kind of positive and like, yeah, I think that looks right to me. Yeah. Nice.
It's now on my queue. I'm requesting it from my library.
It's like it's kind of like one of the it starts out kind of fairly optimistic in tone about this movement. And it really reminded me about like kind of like how like crypto, maybe less so this season, but like maybe like 5 years ago, definitely really had this kind of optimism. and then it just kind of turns into this dystopia. I want to give it away, but they encounter at one point they encounter this like alien they're in like some like artificial intelligence like simulation world in another star system at one point, and they encounter like this alien artificial intelligence whose avatar is like a slug, and it's like so
No
advanced.
slugs. Sorry, I'm
Yeah, it's like so advanced, but like like they can't really fully relate to it, and it can't really
They
relate to
have
them.
slugs?
But like all it cares about is like buying and selling memes,
the
and
meme
so
slug.
they bring it with them. So somehow it hitches a ride with them back to like the Earth planet system, and they
Oh
use
no.
this like sort of like meme like Lord Slug to like infest and take down one of their like enemies. And I think that for some reason that sticks with me a lot when you're saying that kind of like the worst of both worlds, like Lord of the Flies, where we're just getting torn to pieces by like capitalism. We don't have any like protections, like the old world protections don't help at all. Um, Partially because they're not really being applied like they ought to be, and partially because a lot of these like specific rules were written or the precedent was established for a very different context, so it's not easy. Even if it were easy, even if they could reapply, it wouldn't be easy to do so. And I think about that slug, and I'm thinking that if we're not careful, like if we don't actively make decisions and try to do something, go a different direction, like we're gonna be like the only people left will be the slugs.
Well, I do think the Nathan Schneider optimism is warranted. The last time we rapidly encountered a new form of capitalism, which seemed poised to rip us all to shreds and to have found a way around all of our um, defenses and mechanisms for slowing down capital and making a middle class possible. Last time we were at this sort of juncture, co-ops and unions sort of swept in, and mutual aid societies and all sorts of sort of non-profit driven governance structures helped sort of create an equilibrium, right? Like sort of slowed down the progression towards
It
might
took
makes
about
right.
100 years after the
And
start of industrialization, though, to get there. It took a long time.
well, I think it depends where you're looking, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically about like the third quarter of the 19th century as both the
Hmm.
golden age of like post gold rush hypercapitalism, but also collectivization. Like all the Nathan Schneider stuff. Um, I also, because I used to study Argentine history, think a lot about like globally the second half of the 19th century all around the world was this weird crux of like both capitalism going evolving rapidly into like a super powerful set of mechanisms for all that is solid turning into air, but at the same time like people were finding ways to build very unpredictable, previously unthinkable coalitions and lateral movements, and not just like unions in the traditional sense, but all kinds of union and co-op and mutual aid. And like, I do think my only hope really is that the DAO stuff will catch up to the money stuff. Like we keep making more efficient like FX mechanisms, but our DAO thinking is kind of stuck in the early 19th century. And I do think that like um, when I talk about like insurance or collective responsibility or collective enforcement, that doesn't have to be hierarchical or top down. That could be bottom up and collectivist. And I hope it is. Like that would be for me the best outcome would be if people found ways to make bottom up governance responsible for healing the network when the network gets uh, hacked. I don't think like investors are going to save us. I don't think profit's going to save us. I think we've sort of profit is moving fast and breaking things. We need something other than profit to fix things that it breaks.
I think I agree with that. Where I don't classify myself as a communist or probably not really a socialist, and I do think that like using markets and prices and money as a way, as like part of how you allocate resources in a society, I think makes a lot of sense. But I feel like people usually frame it like an either or, and I don't really know. I don't really have like an answer, but I do think that like capitalism, if you define capitalism as using markets and prices and money to allocate resources in a society, I think that is not like the whole story. Like there's like something missing. Like we need more than just that. And I don't know what it is. I think things like unions and co-ops better than nothing, but something tells me like there's more to be done, more.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need more than that to really take ourselves into the 21st and 22nd century, and be productive, efficient, and I don't know, human.
If everything can be measured in coins that can be sold for dollars, everything is in the realm of money. We need coins that cannot be traded for dollars. We need like slow coins. We need non-tradable coins. We need soulbound coins. We need like coins that are just on some other shit. Like anything that's mm, tradable becomes dollars. It's sort of like the sink, like you plug things together and one thing's plugged into the ground, now everything's plugged into the ground. USD is the ground in this metaphor. We need things coated in rubber. We need things that are just like not immune to ground.
It's like that. It's like, so what was that? That old commercial. There's some things in life money can't buy. For everything else, there's
ETH.
Mastercard or whatever, Visa.
There's ETH.
Yeah, for everything else, there's ETH.
ETH will replace MasterCard in our lifetimes, but I'd like to replace more than that.
I I think Ethereum's on the right side of history in that regard. Well, I don't know, Kyra, how are we doing on time?
I think it's about time to wrap it up. Save some for the sequel.
Yeah.
Save some
Sweet.
juice.
Yeah, I'll come back
Yeah,
in a year when I'm working on some new project.
Perfect.
probably like 7 new projects, I would guess.
Yeah.
At least one.
Um,
At least one.
it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for coming on. This has been a great time. Guys, if you liked what we had to say, you hated what we had to say, if you're entertained, please give Bumblefudge a follow and keep track of his exploits. And we'll see where this journey takes us.
Awesome. Talk to you
All
soon.
right.
Sir
Bye.
Bumblefudge, thank you very much. Alrighty.